For 6 days and 7 nights Enkidu was erect as he coupled with Shamat. Whew! Spicy! What's up, readers? I'm Adam, aka A Dude Who Reads, and today I want to talk to you about why I think you should read the Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, I was on a mission to find the oldest piece of complete literature that I could get my hands on. And after a little bit of digging, the piece that I landed on was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a epic poem written in pre-Babylonian times in the cradle of civilization. The earliest poems that talk about Gilgamesh, this character who we believe was based at least on a real living king, go back to as far as 4000 BC. Now, to put that in context, that's about as long before Julius Caesar as Julius Caesar was before us. So the story that we know as the Epic of Gilgamesh actually dates back to about 3000 BC in its most complete form. That version was written in Akkadian, and that is the version that most of us will have gotten our hands on, and that was found on a series of tablets that were the most complete tablets about Gilgamesh that we had. Now, those tablets were pretty beat up. Even if they were relatively complete, probably about half the story was still missing. And so scholars have used previous versions of this story to fill in the gaps in the most complete version that they found, if that makes sense. The other thing you need to understand about Gilgamesh is that he's kind of the ancient world's version of modern-day superheroes. There isn't just one poem about Gilgamesh. In fact, there were a series of poems about Gilgamesh, and the epic that we think of as the Epic of Gilgamesh is just the longest and most complete one. But there are a lot of poems about Gilgamesh that date back to much earlier than the one that I'm talking about that happened in 3000 BC. Anytime you talk about an old piece of literature or anything that's been translated, talking about the specific edition is kind of important because it's going to change the flavor of what you're reading. The edition that I read is the Penguin Classics edition translated by Andrew George. And the reason I'd recommend that you pick up this specific edition is because unlike some other editions, this specific edition goes out of its way to preserve the story in its actual most present current form. What I mean by that is, like I said, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a tablet that was recovered with pieces that are missing. And so there are still pieces of this tablet that are missing, and so you could open this book up literally to any page, just picking a random sentence here. A strong dog's 2 pups, and then in parentheses, will overcome it. That's in parentheses because they used another tablet to fill in that part of the verse. The next verse, fix firm your stance, ... We don't know what the rest of that verse is because we have not actually filled it in. So the thing I like about Andrew George's work is that you get to see what the Epic of Gilgamesh looks like as it is today. So that being said, let's jump into why I think you should be reading this book. Reason number 1 why I think you should read the Epic of Gilgamesh is it's going to challenge you to do a new type of reading. So whereas every other type of reading that you're probably doing if you're reading fiction is following a complete narrative. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, because of the fact that it is an incomplete masterpiece, that there's pieces that are missing, you have to force yourself to put yourself in the historical context and kind of bring your own judgment to bear as to how you fill in the pieces about the stuff that's missing in there. That's the reason why I recommend that you pick up this edition, because if you don't, then what you're essentially reading is someone else's thoughts as to what the missing pieces of the original epic poem were, and you're not giving yourself the chance to force your own creative juices to kind of come up with a way to complete that story. So there's a line in the introduction that I think captures this really well, and that was, approach what lies ahead not as you might the poems of Homer, but as a book part eaten by termites or a scroll half consumed by fire. Accept it for what it is, a damaged masterpiece. So what we're getting here is not a complete work, but it's something that has been ruined by the ravages of time, and that to this day, we're still finding new pieces of this tablet. So if you read this poem 10 years from now, you might read something that is slightly different than what exists today because we're still discovering new parts to this, which I think is super fascinating. Reason number 2 why I think you should read the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is so old that it actually gives us some historical proofs that many of the mythologies that we consider separate and distinct in our modern world have some sort of common underlying roots. So what I mean by that is there's one really clear example in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Towards the end of the epic, Gilgamesh goes out in search of Uttanapishti, which is the person who survived the great global flood and saved two of each animal in order to bring them into the post-flood world. If this sounds familiar, it's because a similar story to this exists in pretty much every single great religion, mythology, whatever you may have. In Christian and in Judeo-Christian belief, it's the story of Noah. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's Uttanapishti. In Hindu belief, there is a similar story. So these stories share this sort of common ancestral thread. Am I saying they all came originally from ancient Babylon? No, I'm not saying that. I don't think anyone has proven that one way or another, but it does give you some sense that a lot of the stuff that we read and that we think of as having been developed separately and distinctly in different parts of the world share some kind of background ancestry, and it forces you to think about our history a little bit differently. And that kind of mental gymnastics is the kind of thing that I think reading should do at its best. So if you're not reading these really old texts, you don't get that flavor, you don't get that understanding, and I think you're missing out on a really important part of understanding how our civilization has come to be. The third reason why I think you should read the Epic of Gilgamesh is because the Epic of Gilgamesh is a story that will show you how little our preoccupations with everyday human experience, how little those have changed over the course of the last 4,000 years. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, ostensibly at its surface, is a story about a man's fear of death, right? Gilgamesh, who is one of the most powerful rulers of his time, he's a hero, he's revered by his people, he's also feared by his people, he's accomplished everything that a mortal could possibly accomplish, but the thing that he is most scared of is death, and so he's seeking out immortality, right? These are not uncommon, these are sort of sentiments that we can think of even today in 2023 and beyond, that we look at our everyday lives and it doesn't matter what we accomplish, it doesn't matter how successful we become, we still have this underlying fear that we're mortal and what is it that we're going to leave behind. So this poem treats topics of immortality and legacy in a way that is so modern that it feels like it could have been written any day now, because the preoccupation that man has with the shortness of our period on this planet is not new. It's something that goes back to the beginning of civilization, and we have proof of it in this single story. In addition to the entire sort of underlying thread of this entire story being about immortality and fear of death and legacy, there are so many other themes that you could just pull into the modern day that would still apply just as well. This is a story about friendship. This is a story about what it takes to be a hero. This is a story about how a ruler should act. This is a story about one's responsibility to family. This is a story about grief. To the one who survived is left grief for a legacy. The dead leave sorrow for those who survive. Now that is a sentence that was written 4,000 years ago. And if you have ever lost anyone, you know just how true and how much that hits close to home. And that to me is just mind-blowing. And finally, the fourth reason why I think you should read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this one is maybe the most important one, overall, it's just a good story. I mean, I can't get over the fact that a story that was written 3,000 plus years ago has so many modern and relevant topics, and it has just so much to it and so much complexity and depth that if you were to take this story today, you can make a modern blockbuster film out of it. I'm serious. This story has everything. It's got a character arc for the protagonist. You see how Gilgamesh evolves over the course of the story from being sort of a selfish, self-centered ruler who fears death to one who accepts his mortality and becomes wiser for it. You've got action, you've got humor, you've got drama, and you even have sex. I'm going to read you just a few of these passages from this book, and you can tell me that this is not something that would make for a great Marvel movie. As the cedar cast its shadow, terror fell on Gilgamesh. Stiffness took a grip on his arms, and tremors beset his legs. He lifted them up, but the sky was too far. He smote the ground, but the bedrock withstood him. At the heels of their feet, the ground burst asunder. They shattered as they whirled, Mount Syrian and Lebanon. Black became the clouds of white, raining down on them death like a mist. Shamash roused against Humbaba the mighty gale winds, south wind, north wind, east wind, and west wind, blast, counterblast, typhoon, hurricane, and tempest, devil wind, frost wind, gale, and tornado. There rose 13 winds, and the face of Humbaba darkened. He could not charge forwards, he could not kick backwards. The weapons of Gilgamesh then conquered Humbaba. Tell me that wouldn't make a kick-ass action sequence. Shamat unfastened the cloth of her loins. She bared her sex, and he took her in her charms. She did not recoil. She took in his scent. She spread her clothing, and he lay upon her. She treated the man to the work of a woman. His passion caressed and embraced her. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu was erect as he coupled with Shamat. Whew! Spicy. Modern romance got nothing on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then one of the most modern tropes of all, there's irony in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The man who fails to achieve immortality in life ends up achieving it in death. That's the kind of irony that you would expect modern audiences to appreciate. This was written over 3,000 years ago. So to wrap this up, I really think you should read the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, this story has withstood the test of time. Even today, it makes for a great read. It'll challenge you to understand where our myths and our legends come from. It'll give you an appreciation for what has come before. This is a story and an epic that set the stage for ancient Greek writing and ancient Greek poems and Homer and those writings. Next up, I'm going to be reading the Iliad, or rereading the Iliad, I should say. So let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to see me do a comparison between the Iliad and the Epic of Gilgamesh at some point in the future. And then from there, I will keep reading the classics in chronological order. And if you want to see some of my other favorite books of all time, make sure to check out my video on my top 10 books of all time. And until next time, have fun reading. Cheers.